But I've got to tell you, the snow was a bit disappointing. It's going to snow. I want some snow. I made that comment on Facebook, and somebody said, well, you're not a farmer. Yeah, but I've got cats to go out and feed, so that counts for something. No, not really. To break up their water, you know. All right, book of Hosea. Does anybody need an outline for Hosea? Okay. All right, so looking at your outline, of course, Hosea, as you open the book, he dates himself. Chapter 1, verse 1 here, the word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So some of your prophets do that. They'll date themselves by both the northern and the southern kingdoms. And so Hosea really narrows himself down here. Jeroboam, and by the way, there were two Jeroboams that reigned in Israel, northern Israel. After the kingdom of Israel split in two, after the reign of Solomon, Jeroboam, he's known as Jeroboam the son of Nebat, became the king of northern Israel. And so this is Jeroboam the second, a couple hundred years later. He reigned from 788 to 747 BC, 41 years. And then Uzziah, king of southern Israel, began his reign in 785. And the last king of Judah he has mentioned here is Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah reigned until 698. So somewhere between 785 and 698, Hosea is doing his writing. So most people just date this book approximated 750 BC. So he's contemporary with, with Isaiah, Amos, Micah, and Jonah. But of course, Jonah, who did Jonah prophesy to? The Ninevites. And so he's in a different region, but Hosea is at home dealing with God's people. The book is very unique because of, just the way it begins, God's instruction. He gives a what and a why to the prophet to illustrate Israel's adulterous relationship. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So the what is, you marry a wife, the New King James says a wife of harlotry. This is her background and perhaps her familial background. And the why is, this is going to be an illustration for what Israel has done to God. And they have 3 children. Start reading in verse 3. The first child, call his name Jezreel. And this has the names of these children obviously have significance, but this name here has a historical significance. Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. So, to understand what exactly is going on here, Jehu was one of the kings of Israel, and part of his, and this is all recorded in 2 Kings chapter 10, part of his work as king was to destroy the household of Ahab. Of course, Ahab was married to Jezebel, and just a wicked, wicked king, and his family was wiped out by Jehu when he became king. And again, all that's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 10. But the names of these children are significant because they have meaning that is applicable to the Israelites. So Jezreel's name means, again, for yet in a little while, I will avenge the bloodshed. Well, it means God scatters. I will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Well, he's looking forward to the Assyrian captivity of the Israelite nation, which if Hosea is written in 750 BC, is going to be about 28 years later or so, 722, 721 BC, when the Assyrians destroy northern Israel and take them captive and scatter their people. A chapter that you might write down next to that phrase, will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel, 2 Kings 17. That details the destruction of, well, not just the destruction, but the reasoning behind the destruction of the house of Israel because of her sins. Verse 5, I'll break the bow of Israel. Well, their strength is going to be broken, is what that means. Then you have a second child, a daughter, and they name this daughter, or are instructed to name this daughter, Lo Ruhamah, which means no mercy. And I will have no mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. All right, well, again, that's looking forward to the Assyrian captivity and the destruction of Israel. But then you have this, but I will have mercy upon the house of Judah. So again, that illustrates the fact that you have the divided kingdom. Judah's in a different state. Remember, Israel, northern Israel had, 18, 19, somewhere in that number, 20 kings, and not one of them was good. Judah had a few more because they lasted longer, southern Israel. But of their 22 or 23 kings, 8 of them were actually good and faithful to God and restorers, reformers in Israel. And so at this point in time, He's having mercy upon the house of Judah and will save them by the Lord their God. So there is a difference in these two. Well, it's the Israelites, but in the northern and southern, there is a difference. And then another son, verse 8, Lo Ruhamah, was born. Call his name Loamai, which means no pity. So the names of these children and the relationship between Hosea and his wife Gomer are all illustrative of God's people and what over time they had done to Him. And this is not the only time that the prophets are used as a sign to the house of Israel and their actions. Jeremiah was used that way on several occasions, but Hosea, I think, is the most graphic. I think that's the best. It's the most graphic display of the unfaithfulness, the adultery, spiritual adultery of the house of Israel against their God. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the book. Any questions or comments on that, on those first couple of points there?
Very well, what you explained to us kind of tells us there are scriptures and I would suspect that the people of that land, when Hosea could see these children and name them, when he named them based upon what their names meant, did those people know what those names meant?
Oh, yes, definitely. And then as he continues, and that's the thing, not just his writing, but the verbalization of this message to the people too. Yeah, the Israelites knew exactly what was going on here with Hosea. Now, as is often the case with these pre-exilic prophets, okay, the prophets that did their work prior to the exiles, prior to the captivities, there's always a message of hope throughout. So, chapter 1, you've got God's going to scatter you. He's not going to have mercy. He's not going to have pity. All right? Those three children's names. Yet, verse 10, the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, you are the sons of the living God. So, you've got the punishment, the doom, the judgment, but you also then have throughout these prophecies the promise of restoration. Children of Israel, the children of Judah shall be gathered together. Verse 11, and appoint for themselves one head. And Hosea is going to deal with that a little bit more here in his book. But it's looking to the future. There's going to be one head over the kingdom of Israel. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Chapters 2 and 4 really lay out the case against God's people Chapter 2, really the first 13 verses. We're not going to read all of this, but let's see here. Verse 4 beginning, Hosea 2:4. And I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms, for their mother hath played the harlot. And he's talking about Israel here, not Gomer. She that conceived them hath done shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers, that gave me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, mine oil and my drink. And so God says, beginning in verse 6, I'm going to hedge up your way. Well, then when you get to chapter 4, there's a more, I would say a more specific description of why Israel finds herself in the place she finds herself. Somebody read Hosea 4. Well, just make it 1 through 6. Somebody read that for us, please.
Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel. For the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying, killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all restraint, bloodshed upon bloodshed. Therefore the land will mourn, and everyone who dwells there will waste away with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea will be taken away. Now let no man contend or rebuke another, for our people are like those who contend with priests. Therefore you shall stumble in the day, the prophet also shall stumble with you in the night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. I will also reject you from being priests for me, because you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children.
And so the first, again, that's Hosea 4, 1 through 6, and you listen to that description. This is not being addressed to some Gentile, polytheistic group of heathens, let's say. This is to God's people, and they're swearing, they're lying, they're killing, stealing, committing adultery. And the King James says they break out. All restraints broken. You have this word in the New Testament, lasciviousness. And it means, well, license, basically. Just no restraint in anything. And that's the condition of God's people. Well, when you look down at verse 6, when you don't know the law of God, well, you're a law to yourself. And so that's exactly what Israel had become over the years. So again, chapters 2 and 4 lay out a very strong case against the sinfulness of the kingdom. But again, when you look in the midst of all that, you look at from chapter 2, 14, and then through all of chapter 3 is again the concept of restoration and being made right with God, promises of blessing. So we looked at chapter, what was it? Chapter 1 and verse 11. Israel and Judah are going to be gathered together. They're going to have one head for themselves, one leader. Well, that's described more specifically in chapter 3. Look at chapter 3, verse 4. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, without an ephod, and without a teraphim. Okay, none of the priestly duties, what he's talking about there at the end, none of that's going to be carried out. Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. Well, again, David's been dead for, let's just say, 250 years. So it can't be David. Well, biblically speaking, in terms of restoration and being led by God, who is King David? It's the Christ. He's, the book of Romans talks about that. The book of Acts repeatedly talks about Christ. But Romans chapter 1 and verse 3 says that Jesus Christ was declared to be that's verse 4, declared to be the Son of God with power according to the resurrection from the dead. But Romans 1 and verse 3 says that he was the son of David according to the flesh. Luke chapter 1, at the birth of Christ, he's going to have the throne of his father David. Acts chapter 2 talks about the same thing. Acts 13. I mean, there are so many passages that talk about this, and that's what Hosea is pointing forward to here ultimately. You know, there would be a restoration after the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. They would come back to their homeland and rebuild the walls and the temple and all that, but this is looking far beyond that. And we know that when it talks about David, them looking to David their king. And then another indicator of that in verse 5 there is that last phrase. The King James says, in the latter days, and the New King James reads the same way. Well, typically when you see that in the Old Testament prophets, the latter days is always talking about the last days, or the days of the, as we call it, the days of the New Covenant. You and I are in the last days. It's like Hebrews 1 and verse 2 says, God has spoken to us in these last days by His Son. All right, so all that language is indicative of what this prophecy is about. So you have a restoration. You have a new covenant even here in chapter 2. Somebody read, read Hosea 2, verse, just make it verse 18, please. Okay, now that sounds like Isaiah chapter 11. You know, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, a child will play on a serpent's hole and not be hurt. Well, that's not talking about literally the earth, you know, kind of like the Watchtower magazine would tell us, that the earth's going to be renovated and there's not going to be any, animals won't be eating each other, there's not going to be any war. This is a spiritual application here, talking about the reign of Christ in that new kingdom of Israel, which is the spiritual kingdom, which is the church. So you have here this new covenant mentioned in Hosea chapter 2 and verse 18. And I know it doesn't say new, but we know from other passages in the Old Testament that that's exactly what it's talking about. I will break the bow and the sword and the battle. The kingdom of Israel, the church today, and the church, by the way, in Galatians 6:16, the church is called the Israel of God, is not a carnal, it's not a physical entity, a political power, or anything like that. It's a spiritual kingdom and a kingdom of peace. So that's what that language indicates there. Hosea has a constant call to repentance. Chapters, and I put in your outline here, chapters 6 and 14. You have the prophet calling the people, let us return to the Lord. And the prophets always include themselves in this. And that's, you know, you have this concept of national repentance and national prayer to God. And that's what we see here. Come and let us return unto the Lord, for He hath torn, and He will heal us. He hath smitten, and He will bind us. After 2 days will He revive us, and in the third day He will raise us up, and we shall live in His sight. Verse 2 there, I've heard some people say, well, that's talking about the resurrection of Christ. No, it's not. This is, you know, you have numerology in the Bible, the study of numbers, okay? And numbers have significant meaning in certain texts. This is one of them. 2 days and 3 days. Well, 3 is typically a number of divinity or deity or completeness. Well, after what happens, we're going to be fully restored. We're going to be brought back to life. Remember Ezekiel, just for instance. Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. Well, that represented the restoration. The restoration of the nation of Israel. It didn't represent a literal, physical, bodily resurrection. Because Ezekiel was told, these bones are the house of Israel. They're going to be restored. So the same concept here. So chapter 6 is a call to repentance. And then chapter 14, the last chapter, same thing. O Israel, return unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast fallen by iniquity. Somebody read chapter 6 and verse 4. Hosea 6:4, please. Okay. What does that mean? Your faithfulness is like the morning cloud. What does that mean? Doesn't last long. We know what fog looks like in the morning, don't we? And how quickly it dissipates after the sun comes up and starts to heat up. That's what their faithfulness is described as. Just here for a brief time and then gone away. And that's been their history throughout the Old Testament. We know that. And so goes away quickly. So the point being here, as I put in your outline, the problem was not with God. Okay, God was not too harsh and demanding and, like in the parable of the talents, the one-talent man, I knew that you were a hard man. No, that's not the problem. God had fully revealed His will for His people, and they, it's like Hebrews 8 and verse 7 says, the problem was with them not keeping the covenant. The problem wasn't with the covenant. All right? Look at chapter 7, verses 8 through 10. Ephraim hath mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. All right? You're burned on one side. You're exposed on one side to everybody around you, and you're not like turning yourself over, like you bake something, and exposing yourself to God the way you ought to. And so that's a problem. Strangers have devoured his strength, and he knoweth it not. He's so used to his condition that it's just normal. Gray hairs are here and there upon him, yet he's aging, doesn't realize it. And the pride of Israel testifieth to his face, and they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek Him for all of this. They're blind to their own condition. To be ignorant about all of us, and you've heard me say this before, we're all ignorant of some things. There's no question about that. There's a lot of things that we don't know. And, ignorance is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, willful ignorance, that's a whole nother story, or willful blindness, and that's what we have here. It's not just that they're in this condition, it's that they're not seeking Him at all. And that's that idea of a cake unturned. They're exposed to one way, but they're not looking at the other side, let's say, and doing what they need to do. So the problem of their unfaithfulness is not with a too demanding of a God. In fact, it's presented quite the opposite. Look over in chapter 11, and somebody read Hosea 11, 1 through 4, please. I gave them everything they needed. So the description there in verse 3 and 4, as you read that, okay? I took them by the arms. I helped them. The King James says, I taught Ephraim how to go. The New King James says, I taught Ephraim how to walk. So looking over here at Watson and Alea, how do you teach a kid to walk? When they start pulling up on furniture, do you just kind of shove them off the furniture and say, all right, start? Well, of course not. You might take your finger and let them hold on each side with one of their hands, and you teach them how to walk. And that's the image here that God has done for Israel. I held them up by their arms and taught them how to walk. And I drew them with cords. He was attached to them and provided everything He needed for them. Well, so the problem then is not with God. The problem is with Israel and her unfaithfulness. But then notice this kind of an emotional plea. How shall I give thee up, O Ephraim? In Ephraim, Ephraim, Samaria, those two words a lot of times are used representative of the northern kingdom as a whole. Okay? How shall I give thee up, Ephraim? How shall I deliver thee, Israel? How shall I make thee as Admah? How shall I set thee as Zeboim? Do you know what Admah and Zeboim are? And why God is concerned? Admah and Zeboim were cities of the plain cities of the plains that were destroyed along with Sodom and Gomorrah. So I've provided everything. How am I going to give you up, deliver you? How can I make it? Because it's coming. The Assyrians are coming. And basically God's asking, how can I tolerate watching this happen to my people? That's what He's asking here. Mine heart is turned within me. My repentings are kindled together. Well, listen to the New King James. My heart churns within me. My sympathy is stirred. All right? My repentings are, it's not the best wording there, but I will not execute the fierceness of mine anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim. Okay, so he mentions, again, Admah and Zeboim. When God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain, did He spare any justice or any wrath? He let it go, didn't He? He brought those places down. Well, He's not going to do that to His people. He says, "For I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of thee, and I will not enter into the city. They shall walk after the Lord." So the punishment's coming, captivity's coming, but it's not going to be a complete end as it was for those cities of the plain. Any questions or comments on any of this? Okay, just quickly, we got just a couple minutes. Look at chapter 11 here. Somebody read verse 12, Hosea 11:12. Okay, so here again is that contrast, as I told you, the northern kingdom and all of her, however many kings she had, 18 to 20, all of them were unfaithful. But Judah, as it points out here, yet ruleth with God. There was still hope for the southern kingdom of Israel. And one of the things we learn with these prophets who are dated like this, who predate the Assyrian assault on northern Israel, again, which is 722 BC. One of the things that we see with those prophets is, okay, Israel's in this condition, their punishment's coming. Judah, her sister, should have learned. And, well, we know that Judah didn't learn, and the Babylonians came against them later. Any questions or comments? Okay. Appreciate your attention.